Praise the Lord. Greetings to you all in the precious name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. In it, it's my great joy and privilege to speak on this virtual chapel. I'm so honored and delighted to do this, and I'm even grateful to God for giving me this opportunity. Nevertheless, I'm grateful to even my friends and family who supported me in their prayers. I give my special thanks to my mentor Vinodji sir, who supported and guided me in preparing this senior sermon. I'm here to speak on the text from the book of Genesis, chapter 26, verse 17 to 22. Book of Genesis, chapter 26, verse 17 to 22. So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. But when Isaac's servant dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Isaac, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." The book of Genesis is the first book in the Bible, as we all are very well aware about it. Even in the Hebrew Bible, it's the first book in the Torah, and it's known as Bereshit, which means in the beginning, as the phrase begins with in the beginning. And the author of this book is Moses, though there are many controversies. However, we traditionally believe that Moses is the author, and the date of composition is in between 1525 to 1405 BC. It's probably the time where Moses was in the wilderness wanderings. And the purpose of this book is to know that God has chosen Israel as a nation for his purpose, not just because of the Israel's worthiness or something, but that's because of God's unmeritable mercy. Now, coming to the text, chapter 26. Here we see the story of Isaac. We all are very familiar with the story, with the birth of Isaac, as he is a promised son to Abraham by God. And here we can see the continuation of this promise, the legacy of this promise. The outline of the book we can see is 50 chapters, which can be divided as two: chapter 1 to 11, the prologue of the Bible, and from the rest of the chapters as ancestral history. And here in chapter 26, we can see there's a repetition of history, as in the days of Abraham there came a famine, and then God speaks with Isaac and asks him not to go to Egypt but to stay in that place. As Isaac stays in that place and gets prosperous, the king and the people over there get jealous of Isaac and ask him to leave the place. It's then Isaac leaves the place, the land Gerar, and goes and gets settled in the valley of Gerar. That is what the portion we have read today. That is the story. It's a story of Isaac as a well digger. It's a story of Isaac who reopened the wells of his father Abraham. So the repetition of the history and the reopening of the closed wells have much to emphasize the God's way of establishing his truth. I'd like to say it again. The repetition of the history and the reopening of the closed wells have much to emphasize God's way of establishing his truth. So what is his truth that lies in this story? It is a story of a well digger. It is a story which says that twice he failed. It's not he failed, twice he just gave his wells to the people who quarreled with him, and then God blesses him. So in the spiritual aspect, I would say the truth is a recall of God for our spiritual wellness. I'd like to entitle my sermon as Recall of God for Spiritual Wellness. In this, we can see four attitudes where we can find it in the story of Isaac. Number one, recall for obedience. verse 17. Recall for obedience, verse 17. Edwin Lewis Cole, the founder of the American religious organization, quoted like this: obedience is an act of faith, and disobedience is a result of unbelief. Obedience is an act of faith, and disobedience is the result of unbelief. Here we can see in this story of Isaac as a well digger. He obeys the king and leaves the place of Gerar. And it honors God. How it honored God? Because God told him not to go to Egypt, but just be there. So Isaac won't leave the Gerar, but instead chose he just chose to stay in the valley of Gerar, and that really honors God. So this is one of the really needed attitudes in our spiritual wellness: obedience. Isaac not just obeyed the king, but he also obeyed the God. That really honored God, not just him. Number two, recall for determination. Recall for determination was 18 and 19. In verses 18 and 19, we can see the determination of Isaac to redig the closed wells of his father Abraham. We can see the courage and the boldness of Isaac, because it's not his state, it's not his people, but there are completely another people, and he is even well aware that those wells were closed by the enemies, but he didn't keep quiet, but he determined, because it's his father's, he have the right to do that, and he wants to claim over it, and he wants to continue his legacy. So in such a way, in such perspective, with that positive attitude, he determined to take up the task, and so he succeeded. And then at the end of the verse 19, we can see, and found there a well of spring water. He even found the well of spring water. So this is a recall for determination. Even in our spiritual lives, even in our spiritual well-being, we should be determined to take up, if at all Satan have closed any of the things that stop God's blessing in our lives. We should be determined to take up the task of moving ahead with positivity, and we should never give up the legacy that we are the children of God. Whatever is hindering us, we should keep it aside, and we should really go ahead for the glory of God. So it's a recall for determination. And my third point is recall for meekness, verse 20 and 21. Recall for meekness, verse 20 and 21. Here we can see the deep patience of Isaac, because twice the herdsmen of Gerar fought with the herdsmen of Isaac over the wealth that actually belongs to Isaac. We all know that Abraham is the owner of the wealth, where Isaac has the right and authority to claim his legacy. But even then, when the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with him, he didn't quarrel back. He just chose to be quiet. He just chose to be meek. That's because, not just because he don't have any power, he don't have any authority to fight back, to quarrel back. That's because he just had a policy of blessed or the meek. He just had his in mind that I should be meek. I'm not supposed to do that, because it doesn't work in a worldly way, but it just needs to be under the guidance of God. And we can also see how Isaac's patience was tested there. However, if we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13, we will never be tested beyond our capabilities. We also need to remember this as we determine to do the ministry of God, as we determine to be obedient to God, and just have a self-analyzation of our spiritual lives to be good and to be well. And there comes a test, but it won't be beyond our ability. Here I feel that God might have tested Isaac to check whether he's going to be meek or whether he's going to quarrel back. Because if you can see the background, he's very prosperous and rich man, and It's not a big thing for him to fight back. It's not a big thing for him to raise his voice, but he's just opted to be meek. So I like to say, even friends, in this context, in this present context, in our spiritual well-being, we should be meek. We should be meek. This is a recall of God for us to be with meekness. And then my final point I like to say, it's recall for fruitful blessings, verse 22, where he just Isaac just moves to another well and then tries for the third time, and then he gets no quarreling. He gets peace. It's like the herdsmen of Gerar won't fight with him. That's like they just keep quiet, because in the before verses, as Isaac keep quiet, he also humorously names them as Isaac and Sitna, just for the remembrance that they contended and quarreled. So in the third well, coming to the third well, the herdsmen of Gerar won't fight with the herdsmen of Isaac. And so Isaac will remember the Lord. Isaac will say, this is not because of my word, but this is because of the worthiness of God. This is because of the worthiness of God. And so he names it Rehoboth, saying that now the Lord has made room for us and we shall be fruitful in this land. Even the great philosopher Aristotle quoted that patience is bitter, but its fruit is always sweet. So here we can see the patience of Isaac in the past two verses, that he just kept quiet when his wells were taken over by the enemies, by the people who were there, but he just kept quiet. He just held with patience. And in the third one, he found a fruitful blessing. Dear friends, even in our spiritual well-being, we God just expects us to be fruitful, because when we are meek, God obviously blesses in a fruitful manner. So this story in the spiritual aspect talks to us and asks us to recheck, to have a recheck on our spiritual well-being. I like to conclude my words by saying that this is a recall of God for our spiritual well-being. We need to be obedient to God. We need to be determined to God, and we need to be with patience and meekness in doing the work of God, in doing for his glory. So in such a way, when we do that, obviously God will bless us in a fruitful way. I'd like to say one last point, that God always honors the fruitfulness. God always honors the meekness. I'd like to conclude my sermon by saying that fruitful blessings are always from the Lord. May God bless you.